Well, okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And it's my honor to be here to have this presentation and to talk about my previous studies when I was in the university. And it's about the mechanistic understanding of the materials degradation in the nuclear reactor environment. And before that, I want to talk about the motivations why I engaged in this field. And it was in 2011 that the Fukushima event happened. And it was in the same year I went to the graduate school. And at that moment, I was shocked by this kind of accident. And I told myself that I should do something in this field. And since then, I always ask myself, what happened to the structural materials in the nuclear reactors? And can we avoid this kind of accident and improve its safety? And how can we do it? And in the following years, I have been devoting myself in this field and try to understand the materials behavior in the nuclear reactor environment. So you may ask that, what is the nuclear reactor environment? Actually, the nuclear reactor environment could be one of the most extreme environments in the world. The materials in the nuclear reactor will have to be withstand the high temperature and pressure and high radiation dose, and also the chemical corrosive environment. And sometimes those environments can couple to each other and make the condition become tougher. So in the following slides, I will talk about two different stories to understand the materials behavior in those extreme environments. The first one is to understand the cleaning corrosion in the nuclear reactors. And the second one would talk about the radiation damaging of the materials in the nuclear reactors. I'm wondering the last row students can hear about. Maybe I can just take off my phone. It's okay for you. Okay, that's great. Let's talk about the first one, the cleaning corrosion. As we know that for the cleaning material in the nuclear reactor, it could be the barrier to protect the corrosion of the nuclear fuel from the coolant, and also can prevent the release of the fission products from outside the environment. And in the current days, most of nuclear reactors are using the zirconia alloy. Actually, this material is very stable in normal operation conditions, but things could be changed in the accident condition. And show here that in the high temperature region, the surface corrosion reaction had happened and damage the surface and induce the cracking of the surface, which may even cause the accident in the nuclear reactors. And since the Fukushima event, one idea of the accelerated tolerant fuel has been proposed, and some new idea to replace the zirconia alloy has been discussed. For example, add additional coating layer above the zirconia surface, or use some advanced materials like the silicon carbon to replace the zirconia alloy. And in the following slides, I will discuss the corrosion behavior of the silicon carbon when it's used as a cleaning material. Actually, silicon carbon is not a new material in the nuclear field. It has been used as a coating in the transfer fuel particle. And due to its excellent property, it has been also proposed to use a cleaning material in the light water reactors. But in recent days, the corrosion experiment found that the surface corrosion reactions can also happen on the silicon carbon surface, as shown in those SEM images. And from the EDS measurement, we can see that the corrosion will occur as the silicon species from the silicon carbon dissolve into the water environment. So in order to satisfy the application as a cleaning material using the light water reactor, we should control the corrosion rate of the silicon carbon. And in order to do so, we should first understand what happened for the silicon carbon. How does the corrosion happen? And previously, people based on the thermodynamic point of view have proposed two different hypotheses. One is we call it the indirect corrosion, which means that the silicon carbon will first interact with the water molecules and form the stable silica layer above the surface. And then finally, the silica layer will dissolve into the water environment as a siliceous acid. Another different hypothesis is that silicon carbon will directly react with the water molecule and dissolve into the water environment as a siliceous acid. But no matter each way, the dynamic process, like the rate-limiting step in the whole corrosion process, are still unknown, which will limit us to understand and control the corrosion rate of silicon carbon. And besides that, as we know that for the cleaning material in the nuclear reactors, it will not be only be damaged by the neutral radiation, but also it can be corroded by the coolant environment. And neutral radiation will not induce the defects in the cladding materials. And also, it can induce the radiolysis effect in the coolant environment, like produce some oxide products, like the oxygen gas. And our previous simulations found that the existence of the oxygen gas in the water environment can definitely enhance the corrosion. It will not only dissolve the silicon species, but also dissolve the carbon species into the water environment. And finally, it can enhance the corrosion rate of the in application. And a similar result have been observed in the experimental measurements. As shown in the red color data, we can see that compared with the water environment, if we consider the radiolysis effect, we can see that the corrosion rate can be definitely enhanced, especially in the polycrystal silicon carbon. And another thing I want to show here in the image is that if we consider the neutral radiation, like show the blue color data, we can see the corrosion rate can be further enhanced. But here it raises another question, because as I mentioned, neutral radiation can not only induce the damage in the solid material, like the cladding material, they can also induce the radiolysis effect in the cooling environment. So it could be a coupling effect between them together. So the question would be the 1+1 question. It means that whether the coupling effect will have a positive effect on the corrosion rate or the negative effect. So in order to answer this kind of question, we should first know that whether the radiation damage only in the solid material can enhance the corrosion or not. So for those both questions, in the following slides, I will show our studies. The first one, we will try to answer the question that what's the kinetic mechanism for the corrosion, and what's the rate limiting step in the whole corrosion process. And after that, we will discuss the radiation damage effect on the silicon carbon corrosion. Let's talk about the first one, the kinetic mechanisms. Generally, the kinetic process for the hydrothermal corrosion of the material can be divided into 3 steps. The first step I call it the water absorption. It means that the water molecule above the surface will first dissociate above the surface, and then those species will be absorbed on the surface. And in this stage, the surface atoms are still very happy. But as time goes by, the smell has gone. We can see that those absorbed species will try to damage the surface and break the surface bond. And eventually, the surface atom will dissolve into the water environment. It means that corrosion will happen. So the question is that how does the silicon carbon corrosion happen in the water environment? Whether it will form the stable silicon layer, or it will directly dissolve as silicylic acid. So to answer those questions, we can first go back to the history to check the literature to see what happened for some other materials. And if we go back to the history, we can see that a lot of most of the people will claim that it is because of the oxygen incorporation reaction will be responsible for the surface damage, especially in the metals and also in the silicon material. As for example, for the silicon material, we can see that as the water molecule absorbed on the surface, it will dissolve as a hydrogen and a hydroxyl, and the hydroxyl will further dissolve as a hydrogen and oxygen. And in this case, the oxygen will try to break the silicon bond as shown here and to damage the surface. So based on this kind of phenomena, we may assume that for the silicon carbon, the similar reaction may also happen. So based on those assumptions, we have tried to study the silicon carbon surface and calculate the reaction energy for this kind of reaction on the silicon carbon surface, as shown in this image. From this image, we can see that the reaction energy for the oxygen incorporation reaction on the silicon carbon surface is very positive, and also is very high and also positive, which means that this kind of reaction is very difficult to happen on the silicon carbon surface. So we should ask what really happened on the silicon carbon surface. And then we go to our simulations, atomic simulations. And in our simulations, we found that instead of the hydrogen or oxygen incorporation, we found that it's a hydrogen incorporation reaction that breaks the surface bond, induce the hydrogenization reactions. And here is one example I showed. The hydrogen atom will dissolve from the water environment, and then will try to break the silicon carbon bond. And in our this is very interesting because we know that normally we thought the hydrogen can stabilize the surface and passivate the downlink bond on the surface. But here we found that the hydrogen will damage the surface bond and break the surface. And in our simulation, we further found the additional hydrogenization reaction will tend to break the additional silicon carbon bond, and then it will displace the silicon atom outside the surface, as shown here. And then the silicon atom will tend to interact with the additional multiple water molecules, and then it will have a lot of reactions, like the acetyl hydrolysis and dehydrogenation reactions will happen on the surface. And then it will form some characterized motif, as shown here. And this characterized motif will further evolve, and eventually it will dissolve as a siliceous acid into the water environment. And from those processes, we can see that there is no stable silica layer above on the surface, and the silicon species in the silicon carbon will directly dissolve as a siliceous acid into the environment. And furthermore, we have further calculated each kind of reaction barrier and to compare with them and try to determine which one is the limiting step in the whole corrosion process. And here show the result. And from here, we can see that the hydrogenization reaction actually have the highest reaction barrier to damage the surface, which means that the hydrogenization reaction could be the limiting step in the whole corrosion process. Actually, this result is very comparable with the experimental measurements and the measure the activation energy from the experiments. Those results can further confirm that the hydrogenization reaction will play an important role in the whole corrosion process. And another point I want to mention here is that even though we didn't see the silica layer above formed on the surface, we do find some characterized motif and characterized reactions that happen on the during the silicon carbon dissolution process. And those motif and reactions have been observed in the silica dissolution previously. So based on above result, here I have two takeaway points. The first one is we have identified the elementary steps for the silicon carbon surface during the hydrothermal corrosion process. And we also have identified the limiting step. It is a hydrogenization reaction that can play an important role in the whole corrosion process. And the second point I will mention that here is that the corrosion of the silicon carbon is due to the directly forms the siliceous acid, and it will dissolve into the water environment. And the second the second part I want to mention here is after we discuss the corrosion reactions, we can further study the radiation damage effect on those reactions. And let's continue to do that. And here I want to mention that I will mainly focus on the green boundary region. As I mentioned before, the polycrystal, it will have multiple green boundaries. It will be easy to be after irradiation, it will be definitely enhanced under radiation conditions. So that's why we mainly focus on the green boundary region corrosion. And we know that the radiation in the materials can create a lot of defects, like the interstitials or the vacancies in the materials. And as those defects close the green boundaries, it can be trapped by the green boundary. And as more defects are trapped on the green boundary, the segregation will happen. Which means that radiation induces the segregation. Actually, this phenomenon is very common in the metallic systems like alloys. And in the alloys, the radiation-induced segregation can cross the local structure and local chemistry changes in the green boundary region. And then finally, it may affect the property of the materials, like the corrosion resistant property. So for the silicon carbon material, in our recent studies, we also found the radiation-induced segregation and green boundary. Here is one specific example. If you look at the left-hand figure, we can see before radiation, the carbon concentration and green boundary region is lower than 50%. But after radiation, we can see the concentration of the carbon have been definitely increased to be around 50%. So based on those phenomena, we may ask the question whether the radiation-induced segregation and green boundary region can also affect the corrosion behavior or not, like the local chemistry changes, whether affect the corrosion behavior of silicon carbon. So in order to answer the question, we can first identify what the corrosion reactions and the green boundary region. And based on our simulations, we further identify that the hydrogenization reactions can also play an important role in the green boundary region to damage the surface. And after that, we can discuss then how does the local chemistry change affect the corrosion reactions. And here we have considered three different local chemistry conditions. One is the stoichiometric condition, another is the carbon-rich condition, the third one will be the silicon-rich condition. And then we have calculated the reaction energy for the hybridization reaction and each different conditions. And here we can see the images. And from here we can see the voice points is that in the carbon-rich systems, the reaction energy for the hybridization has been definitely increased compared with some other systems like the stoichiometric condition or silicon-rich conditions, which means that the hybridization reaction is surprised in the carbon-rich systems. Actually, the similar result have been also observed in our experiments. And here we show the EDS measurement to see the thickness of the corrosion layer. We can see that compared with the non-irradiated samples, after irradiation, we can see the corrosion layer of the sample has been definitely reduced compared with the non-irradiated samples, which means that the radiation induced degradation and the silicon carbon grain boundary can definitely slow down the dissolution of the silicon species into the water environment. So based on those results, I also have two takeaway points. The first one is that I want to say that the radiation damaging in the solid material is not always bad for the materials. Here I show one example is that the radiation-induced degradation of the carbon-rich environment can suppress the corrosion reactions and the grain boundary region. And the second point I want to mention here is that our above result can provide some strategies to design the materials with a high corrosion resistance property. For example, we can modify the local stoichiometric conditions in the grain boundary region, and then to enhance the corrosion resistance property of the materials. This is the first topic about the corrosion damage of the materials in the nuclear power plant. And the next step, I will talk about the radiation damage of the materials on the radiation conditions. As I mentioned before, the radiation in the materials it means that it can be described as the energetic particle try to kick out the atoms in the materials, and then it will cross the interstitials, and in the original position, it will leave the vacancies. And actually, we know that radiation can induce a lot of defects. Not only the interstitial vacancy, it can also induce the transmutation products in the materials. And generally, most of those defects can be recovered, but still some of them will be left in the materials. Will either be form the cluster or will be trapped in the grain boundary region. And those kind of defects will affect the material's property or degrade the material's performance. Here is one species example. I want to show that radiation-induced swelling in the material, in the silicon carbon materials when used as a transfer field particle. And we can see that radiation-induced swelling can cross the swelling, and then the swelling can cross the cracking of the materials, which may induce some safety issues like the release the fission products from the field. So in order to avoid these kind of issues, it is necessary to understand how the swelling happens in the materials. And previously, people claimed that the swelling is because of large clusters. We can see from the TEM, the very large cluster, the defect cluster size could be larger than 1 nanometer. But the contribution of those large clusters can only be responsible for less than 50%. So how about the others? Where are the rest of them from? And also people assume that it could be from some very tiny small clusters or some invisible point defects in the materials after radiation. But because of the limitation of the experimental technique, it's very difficult to prove these kind of assumptions. And so the question here is that whether those invisible point defects or the tiny small clusters were really responsible for those swelling. If so, how could we quantify those contributions, the defect contributions to the swelling? And in the following, I will try to answer those questions. And to answer those questions, we have developed the integrative method and try to combine the experimental measurements and also the multiscale modeling studies. And then we can predict the defect distributions in the samples. And after that, we can quantify the contribution of those defects in the materials. Okay, let's show again. In this is the experimental part. from this experiment, we have 2 points animation. The first one is that after we use the STEM measurement, we can see a lot of very small tiny defects show up in the reviewed samples, which is difficult to be observed from the traditional TEM measurement. Another point I want to mention is that those small tiny defects were prefer to stay along the 1-1-1 plane, and which means that the clusters can have some performance morphology in the irradiated samples. And in the simulation part, we have developed the multiscale cluster dynamic model, and based on some well-known physics, like the point defect generation, as shown here, and also the defect migration, and also the defect reactions, whether it's recombination or form some clustering. And based on those well-known physical phenomena, we have developed the model, and here I show the result. I know this result is very ugly. It's very different from the experimental measurements. So it gave us some suggestion that based on the well-known physics model, we cannot get a well result. So it means that we have missed some new physics during the radiation process. So what kind of physics we have missed? And then we go back to do some atomic simulations and also check the literatures. Here I list the 3 important physics we have missed and listed in our model. The first one is the cluster production. As we know that previously we assumed that irradiation will first create the point defects, and then the point defects will interact with each other and then become the cluster. But actually, during the radiation conditions, the cascade can directly create some small clusters, as shown here. Issue here. Another physics we miss is the cluster diffusion. In the silicon carbon, we know the cluster, when it formed, is very stable. It's difficult to be diffused to another place, which means that this cluster is very immobile. But during the radiation process, the ion radiation can induce the electron stirring power, which means that it can emit the electrons and then make the local event become heated, and the temperature in that local region will be very high compared with others. And those high temperature will enhance the diffusion of those small defect clusters. And the third point I want to mention, as I mentioned before, from our experimental measurement, we observed some preferred morphology for the clusters in the silicon carbon. So based on after we include those 3 phenomena, we will develop our model. And at this moment, we can see the result, showing the right-hand images. We can see that at this moment, our current model can predict the experimental measurement very well. So after that, we have further quantified the contribution of those defects on the radiation to the swelling, as shown here. Previously, if we only use the experimental measurement, we can only get the large defect cluster contribution to swelling. But now, when we use the integrative method, we can get all those kind of defects contribution to the swelling. And we can see that the small clusters and the invisible point defects will play an important role in the swelling process. Here I should also two takeaway points. The first one is that we have developed one integrative method to review the new physics for the silicon carbon swelling, and also we found that we can use that kind of model to quantify the defect swelling contribution. The second point I want to mention is that the small and invisible point defects will play an important role in the swelling process. Okay. Finally, I want to make a summary and a general summary about this. The first point I want to mention is that the integrative method, like combined with the experiments and computations, will provide a powerful tool to understand the radiation and the corrosion damage of the materials in the nuclear reactors. And a better understanding of the material's behavior will provide some strategies to optimize the material's performance in the nuclear reactors. And finally, after we improve the performance of the materials, eventually we hope we could enhance the safety of the reactors. And finally, I hope we can avoid those kind of accidents in the future. Those are my talk. Thank you.